Good evening and welcome to everyone watching tonight's episode of MEDtalkx, brought to you by Pendle 103.1 FM and also live on Facebook and YouTube. My name is Fahim Shakur, one of your regular hosts. It's Tuesday night, it's 8 p.m. and so big thank you to all of you for tuning in. And we're available for questions as per usual on the usual WhatsApp number and phone line. And over the course of the next 1 hour with my guest, who I'll introduce very shortly, we hope to be discussing and talking through as much as we can about gambling. Gambling is a huge topic. There's so much to discuss and it affects so many parts of society. So if you have any questions, we've got two experts on the actual topic tonight. Please get them off your chest. Before I start, I do want to just go through some housekeeping. If you or a loved one have been affected or are affected, you see scrolling down on the screen a very good charity that helps, GamCare.org.uk. You can call them as well. It's a free phone number, I gather, 0808 8020 133. And I'll put that on later on in the show. Please do seek help. Earlier, the better. In addition to that, our producer has said that I can plug something we're doing tomorrow. So I do want to mention that obviously we're in a time of COVID and that is obviously irrepressible and everywhere. And it's important to know more about the COVID vaccination, which is out now. So we're doing a full COVID vaccine webinar tomorrow, available to the public, wherever you might be in the UK or abroad. Please just click on the website, tinyurl.com/COVID vaccination, sign up. And we've got two world experts tomorrow talking about that. Dr. Mohammed Munir, who's a virologist from Lancaster University and actually is working on a COVID vaccine himself, along with Dr. Sarah Zaidi from the United States of America, who's a public health specialist and an Ivy League graduate as well from Brown and Harvard Universities. Should be fascinating. On to tonight's show. Neil Platt and Suhayl Patel are my guests. And they're from Beacon Counselling Trust.co.uk. You can see that scrolling down at the bottom of your screen. Neil Platt is the clinical director at Beacon Counselling Trust. A warm welcome to you, Neil, tonight.
Good evening for him.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and time with us. And Suhayl Patel is the BAME Community Connector in the field of gambling-related harm. Warm welcome to you, Suhayl.
And to you, Fahim. Nice to be here.
Thank you again for your time and attention tonight. So I want to start with you, Neil, if I may. Tell us about gambling, actually, as really the definition. What is gambling? How does it manifest in society? And then let's move on to problem gambling after that, please.
Well, Fahim, let's keep this whole issue pretty simple. A person is gambling whenever he or she takes the chance of losing money or belongings, and when winning or losing is decided mostly by chance. Gambling in the UK has grown at an unprecedented rate over the last decade in the UK, and is an increasingly popular recreational activity. So while when we go back in time, gambling was once illegal and viewed as a rather disreputable activity, social norms have shifted, in particular with the Gambling Act of 2005. Gambling is now a multi-million pound industry in the UK, and its growth is likely to continue. So while some may consider gambling only to be associated with the likes of maybe casinos or horse racing, there are countless activities that are considered gambling. So maybe just a couple of ways that people may not consider or may not be in their awareness around gambling. Obviously, there's lottery tickets, there's slot machines and FOBTs. That's the fixed odd betting terminals that we see. Bingo, casino games. Obviously, there is the horse racing. But then there's the massive relationship with sports betting now in the UK. Very, very few people will go and watch football or a sporting event without gambling. Scratch cards, card games, to name but a few, tombola or similar games. But then more increasingly, we've got the issue of the internet. Individuals having smartphones now, in particular with young people, have all of these betting apps, contained within it. And then, more remotely, we've got the issue of, say, high speculative investing, like stocks and shares, which is still gambling. So, we've got, it's pretty wide, really.
That's really good. Some of my friends will be interested to hear that stocks and shares is gambling. So definitely want to discuss further. Suhayl, if you can actually give a little bit about your background and how gambling means so much to you, please, for the audience.
Which I kind of experienced in my late 20s and early 30s, and I kind of engaged in it recreationally, albeit secretly, and then it kind of manifested in becoming like a coping strategy. Although at the time I didn't recognize it, just saw it as a financial issue. It quickly became something that I turned to when finding things difficult, or it was only until it became unbearable that I kind of saw which I as stigma and the shame. Then what happened was that I decided to kind of work for Beacon Counselling Trust in raising more awareness, in breaking the silence around gambling related harm and those suffering in silence, and the very close link between gambling and suicide. I felt that that's something that can easily, those links can be made very easily with gambling well. So instead of moving on after my kind of recovery through the Beacon Counselling Trust, I felt it quite important to use that resilience to help others in the community. So that's why it's a topic which I'm passionate about, but generally addiction in general as well. And what I'm witnessing is that although individuals from our communities tend to gamble or engage in addictive or compulsive type of behavior less, the level of harm is much, much greater. There's a disproportionate level of harm. And unfortunately, people only seek support when things are at a crisis point, when a lot of the damage has been effectively done. As I'm sure Neil agree with that as well.
Yeah. So, Neil, I guess what I'm hearing, the maxim prevention is better than cure, maybe applies to gambling as well. But do tell us a bit more, Neil, about Beacon Counselling Trust itself. What is it and what does it do?
The Beacon Counselling Trust for him is a mild to moderate mental health support provider on the tin, although we obviously engage in more complex issues. We work on a variety of community-based mental health programs that can be general mental health, GP referrals, etc., through the IAP program. It can be young people's, it can be veterans, it can be eating disorders. We work on quite a variety of mental health programs. Contained within that cocktail of programs is that I lead on the treatment, education and support program for those affected by problematic gambling across the northwest of England, and that starts basically from the Welsh border and runs up the northwest up into the Scottish border. That's a free program that is commissioned through GambleAware and GamCare for those who are affected or experiencing problematic gambling.
Okay. And Suhayl, you recently had a conference to do with gambling for the BAME community. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, Suhayl?
Yeah, the conference itself was the first of its kind in the UK, something never done before. It was only after the work which we did with the Beacon Counselling Trust, where over the last 12 months at least, we managed to access a lot of seminaries, faith leaders, individuals within the BAME community, that we felt that a conference to bring people together was very important. So we managed to bring GamCare, the Gambling Commission, and other very important players from abroad as well to the conference. And it was a great success because the testimonies in the conference were quite powerful. And I think anecdotally, people tended to agree that, yeah, it's a growing issue. And specifically with South Asian communities, that's what we felt. And our focus in the next coming months will be to look at interventions and tailor our support in a very culturally appropriate way. So we were very pleased to have that conference, and we had over 80, approximately close to about 90 to 100 people attending the conference itself online. So it was really good in that sense.
Excellent. I wish I could have attended. It sounds like a really productive conference.
Mm-hmm.
Neil, we've already got questions coming in, which is quite early for this show, but obviously shows the level of enthusiasm and interest. One of them that's come in, if you could address it as best you can. What is addiction? What's triggering it? What's dopamine? Can you talk a little bit about on these topics and relate it back to gambling for us?
Well, yeah, I think we can. I think that addiction has lots of different characteristics, and they manifest themselves in numerous ways. But generally speaking, addictions manifest and share three common characteristics, often referred to as the 3 C's that we call them: compulsive use, loss of control, and continued use. And those three, say, the compulsive use has 3 elements: what we call reinforcement, craving, and habit, to keep it really simple. If we want to go into some more detail, if we've got the time to do that, and I'm not sure about this, but reinforcement refers to a process in which the behavior to use is strengthened by a previous experience, such as the relief of pain or distress. And we often find that when we link this with gambling, there is a link to these sort of reinforcement issues. We then move on to craving, and this psychological or physiological need for the substance or the addiction triggered by some form of brain activity. And we see that within the fixed op betting terminals in particular, with the repetitive use of those machines. And then where we've got the habit, where it becomes quite habitual, which refers to an automatic, compulsive pattern of behavior. And all of these link back to some of the feelings of reward that people get from problem gambling. It's not fundamentally different to other substance or alcohol addictions, except that we don't see, this is the big issue with it, we don't see the physiological witness marks. You, anybody else will see somebody who is clearly in the chronic or acute stages of a eating or alcohol or a substance misuse addiction. But the problem is with the gambling is that there are very, very few witness marks.
Excellent, Neil. I want to welcome Mehran, my co-host, as well, to everyone as well. Thanks, Mehran.
Thank you. Thanks, Fahim. And sorry, guys, got held up with father duties, but nevertheless, it's all done. So all the fathers out there, big up to yourself. But yeah, so what about Miss Fahim?
No, just introduce Suhayl, Neil. We've set the scene about gambling. We've talked about Beacon Counselling Trust and addictive behavior. And Suhayl's told us a little bit about his background. So I'm just going to move on now to Suhayl. And can you tell us a bit about what would you have liked from others when you had this gambling problem? How can family members support someone who's gambling, and and really, what can members of the family do with someone who gambles? Can you tell us a little bit about your lived experience, what you would have liked?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there are 3 things that are quite important for families or friends or affected others that they could display. And one is the genuineness to help that person. The other is empathy, being able to truly understand what that person is kind of going through. And a lot of times within certain cultures, obviously a lot of people attribute it to personal choice, that you chose to gamble, then you live with the consequences of it. And this is very true, that obviously we have autonomy, people, but addiction never takes place in a vacuum, or we are socialized, our environment plays a big effect. So I think what individuals who are struggling with addictions, gambling addictions, need most is empathy, and for affected others, individuals, to display help-seeking behavior. So that could be safeguarding families. So, for example, finances, safeguarding them so that the individual doesn't have access to large amounts of money, etc. And the other is to try and separate the gambler to the individual, and understand that certain choices are made under the influence of that person needed to gain that dopamine hit, or for that person who's chasing their losses, etc. So ultimately, a lot of times it's also about repressed feelings. So building a safe space within the family or outside of the family network, where the individual is able to kind of talk about what they are feeling. Because I believe ultimately it's down to this. Talking therapy helped me massively, and I believe that's something that many individuals who gamble tend to repress within them, that frustration, and they tend to try and juggle so many things in their lives, and subconsciously they are afraid to tell all, because as soon as they do that, then they need to come to terms with the consequences of their behavior and actions. So if I say, okay, I admit I've got a gambling addiction, now I've got to take responsibility for every single thing that's there. Now, in order to do that, I've got to trust the audience, I've got to trust the person that I'm opening up to, if it's family. And many times the initial reaction would be of shock, of horror, and this is the reaction that we tend to avoid and not want, and tend to duck and dive away from. So these are just snippets of kind of advice which I feel could be effective. So even though the individual might be, on a self-destruct mode, but don't give up. Show that love, show that empathy, and just let them know that you're there when they're ready. So to never close those doors of kind of, so that they're able to approach you whenever that time is.
Suhayl, he talked about an important point about taking responsibility, but perhaps there are some situations where an individual can't take responsibility or is unable to because of whether it's physical health conditions or mental health conditions. What's your experience in on the role that plays?
It's quite interesting, because many individuals, when they're in the throes of gambling and in the thick of it, then they lose all semblance of control, and individuals who are seemingly holding up professional jobs, and they could be accountants, they could be teachers, then they tend to fall quite low. And one of the things is that individuals are kind of gripped in that their brains, the neural pathways are almost rewired, and they almost become helpless. And we know that comorbidity is quite common. So individuals who may have a gambling addiction at the same time may have a drug addiction, alcohol addiction. So that's quite difficult to navigate. So you're right that sometimes they're almost helpless, and find that as a coping strategy. So the more they engage in that behavior, the more they kind of are self-medicating themselves. Because gambling in itself, although people might feel, okay, does it have the same effect of drugs and alcohol? It absolutely does, because it's not the actual win a person is seeking. It's just a couple of seconds before, when you place that bet, it's that adrenaline that person gains. And it's just like alcohol, it's just like that drug, that whiz or that buzz that individual kind of experiencing. So I believe that, especially at the Beacon Counselling Trust, we have the tiered support system, and tier 4 is for more complex cases where individuals could be having other mental health disorders, and within that they get that support for their gambling as well.
Okay, thank you, Suhayl. We've got questions coming in, and I'll let Fahim ask. But before he does so, Neil, I wanted to get your perspective as to why is there a difference between genders from your experience, and what role does negative early experiences have a role to play when it comes to gambling?
I think it's an interesting question, Miran. Is that first of all, we're starting to see a substantial increase in females gambling more and more. When you look back at history and you look at the, I suppose, the development of drugs, alcohol, and the differences in gender, the girls were lagged some way behind the boys in this regard, and then it's caught up quite significantly. So it's pretty equal depending on the stats that you look at with drugs and alcohol, etc. But the gambling, we're still seeing females lagging significantly behind. However, we've seen a sharp increase in the females accessing support treatments over probably the last 2 years. The reasons behind that are varied. But one of the things that we see with females is that the predominant area is probably 30 plus. And as they move into the early 50s, and there are some links that are being explored at the moment with the menopause.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you for that, Neil.
In terms of early life experiences, one of the things that we're seeing is that one of the major risk factors that we see is, with adverse childhood experiences, early trauma, etc. The reality of it is we don't know why, very, very simply, why somebody goes on to develop a gambling addiction. But what we do know is that there are a number of risk factors, one of which is childhood trauma and other traumas in life. But unfortunately, one of the main issues that we see, and I know that we'll go on to talk about young people a little later, is the intergenerational transmission of young people who are the children of problem gamblers.
Wow, sounds like a lot to explore there over the course of tonight. Neil, we've got more questions coming in. I'd like you to take one if that's okay. Should cues such as advertisements on the TV or internet for gambling be banned, like we've got the ban on adverts for cigarettes? What's your theory or thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there is a movement that's coming with that. I think the public health, this is ratcheting up the public health agenda, right? Now, unfortunately, within the UK, a lot of the advertising is conditioned, is regulated through codes of practice, and there are a number of the number of pressures that are being exerted from the Gambling Commission from other bodies to reduce the numbers of advertising. There is an inextricable link between, let's say, use sport as an example, right? Look at the Premier League. I think it's something like, other than 2 of the major sides are sponsored by a gambling company, and there is an inextricable link between the shared sponsor, right, the club, and the young fan. And we've got major problems with young people gambling in the UK. So do I believe that there should be some restraint on that? Absolutely.
Okay, I think now is a good time just to take stock for those who might have joined us a bit late and are wondering what we're talking about. We're talking about gambling tonight, and there's a lot of help for problem gambling on the NHS UK website. In particular, there's questions on there. Are you a problem gambler? And it asks, for instance, do you bet more than you can afford to lose? Do you need to gamble with larger amounts of money to get the same feeling? Have you tried to win back money you have lost? The concept of chasing losses that Suhayl mentioned at the beginning part of the program. Have you borrowed money or sold anything to get money to gamble? Have you wondered whether you have a problem with gambling? Has your gambling caused you any health problems, including feelings of stress or anxiety? Have other people criticized your betting or told you that you had a gambling problem? Regardless of whether or not you thought it was true, has your gambling caused any financial problems for you or your household? or have you ever felt guilty about the way you gamble, or what happens when you gamble? I think there's a lot of questions there for people to mull over. And if they're thinking, yeah, a lot of this is relating to me or someone who's a loved one, then do get in touch with the resources we've provided. And the NHS UK website is scrolling again at the bottom of the screen. Suhayl, I want to come back to your lived experience again, please. People are asking about actual support that's available. So you said about what family could have done, but what other tangible support did you receive, and would you actually promote for other people to do to get out of the hole of problem gambling?
Yeah, so firstly, the first step would be to kind of self-exclude yourself from the websites that you're engaging with. The other is to potentially install some gambling blocks on the phone or PC. Then the support which is available is the therapy through the Beacon Counselling Trust, which is available throughout the Northwest, and that talking therapy helps a lot, because ultimately what the counselor therapist would do with you is go through your gambling history, your behavior, the reasons for you to gamble, managing feelings, managing stress, and it's a very safe space for an individual to explore their gambling behavior and history, and just to ask the question, how much do they want to take control of, because some individuals might want to continue. So it's completely at the client is in control, and that's how you roll with it. And the other support service which I accessed was simultaneously was Gamblers Anonymous. Now it's obviously like Alcoholics Anonymous, a fellowship. Now I went there for approximately just less than 12 months, or maybe 12 months approximately, and I was dressed in the Islamic attire. I was quite embarrassed when I went first time, because there was just myself who was from Asian origin, and I was very ashamed, embarrassed to actually go there. However, over time I felt listened to, so each individual there could resonate with me and my experiences, and there was a lot of empathy, love, support. I could ring anybody at any time for help. If I, let's say 1 o'clock in the morning, if I wanted support, then I would be able to get that help from that individual. So, but I do understand that Gamblers Anonymous might not be for everybody. So the Beacon Counselling Trust or GamCare, charities such as those are quite effective in getting you that support that you need.
Great, thank you, Suhayl. And I guess I'm just going to put a interesting report. You probably both have read it. It's the House of Lords report earlier this year about gambling and the harm it causes. It's interesting that most of the revenue that they receive are from a very small minority of what they see as problem gamblers. Is that where the focus needs to be, or are there other preventative measures that we need to put in place? I guess I'll ask Neil for that answer.
Absolutely, we need to take a public health approach to this. This is a public health issue, and it's not just to be directed at individuals where the addiction has taken hold. We need to do much more upstreaming. Go back to the issue of young people. Somewhere in the region of about 350,000 people, that is 11 to 16, gambled with their own money last week, according to research. So we need to take a public health approach to this. We need to look at it on a much wider platform. And, the reason why we need to do that is not just with problem gamblers, but with the entire issue of what we call gambling-related harm. And those experiencing gambling-related harm from a public health perspective, let me give you just one stat, is that those individuals are 3 times more likely to have visited their GP in the last year due to a mental health issue. Now, we just take that in isolation before we move on to some of the other information that we have. It starts to, to indicate why this needs to be taken seriously as a public health issue.
Because the same report, Suhayl, highlights that more than 50,000 individuals with, I guess, following on what Neil was saying about the rise in young individuals who are involved in gambling. That they sit between the ages of 11 and 16. So what do we need to do as a society? And I guess what do parents need to be aware of? Because there's lots of access, there's lots of information that's readily accessible, whether it's through the iPad or the mobile phone. And I guess the concept of having a chance or a prize is very easily accepted in many aspects of society. So what do we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, Neil talked about this just before about the gamblification of sport. So, young people generally, we know, are into football, so they're very much exposed to gambling, and as a result, even on YouTube, a lot of times, depending on your browsing history, the sometimes even not related to your browsing history, you will find adverts pertaining to gambling, and within actual FIFA games as well, you will find gambling taking place in the form of loot boxes, skins betting, and I think technology in itself is growing at a level or at a speed where it's difficult for parents to kind of understand what is going on, because one minute they're trying to learn about how to kind of set controls upon screen time, etc., etc. However, the technology has progressed so far. So I think it's about schools, parents empowering the child to make, especially young people, when they're 13, 14, 15, their impulse control is very weak. So if they do engage in such games, then they're more likely to kind of recreate that buzz, that feeling again. Or if they've lost something, or on the loot box, if they didn't get the player that they desired, they're more likely to keep doing it until they get the player. So from a very young age, in the formative years, it's almost a child is cultured into kind of gambling or taking a risk, or engaging in that risky kind of behavior. And then what we do see is, after the age of 21, we tend to see problems then surfacing, greater problems. So individuals might then get access to a amount of money, then the stakes become bigger and higher, and the consequences also resonate with that as well. So I think, a lot more work needs to be done around preventative education. That's what we tend to do at Beacon as well, where we go into schools. I've been to madrasas, mosques, doing presentations, especially around the link between gambling and gaming, and gambling in itself as well as a standalone kind of activity. And within our culture, if you look at in Urdu, the term for gambling is jua, and to me, when growing up, jua meant cards. I thought it was however, now gambling is, you can gamble on netball, volleyball, all sorts of, you can bet on whether Trump or whoever, the American elections that just went past, so the access to gambling is huge, massive. So I think we need to focus our education, make it relevant in that way.
I think they're still taking bets on that, aren't they?
Neil, COVID-19 is something that's always the elephant in the room, and gambling's no different. We know the pandemic continues to affect everyone across Great Britain, and obviously there's lockdown periods, obviously the tier system. And can you tell us a little bit about what you've noticed in terms of COVID and gambling patterns, or perhaps people accessing your service, or what you know of the effect of COVID and the pandemic on the gambling scene?
Yeah, it is. Let's start off with COVID has led to significant problems across the globe, and is impacting on our lives in so many different ways. And there's some obvious and not so obvious reasons why we're witnessing an increase in problem gambling. But I want to take it back just to Suhayl's observation for 1 minute about young people and the education, and this fits into COVID. The reality of it is, it's quite difficult for young people to gamble in the UK, with the various regulations, checks and balances that are in place for a young person to gamble. The reality of it is, you quoted some figures before about young people and their issues with gambling. The vast majority of a young person's gambling is done with the collusion, if not facilitated by an adult. That's the reality of it. It's a criminal offence to do a bet for a kid under the age of 18 in the UK, generally speaking. Yeah, it's a Section 6 offence and one of the cornerstones of the Gambling Act of 2005, and yet nobody ever gets prosecuted for it in the UK. So what we have then is the normalisation of a criminal act for young people in the UK, and that has been exacerbated during COVID. So we've seen an increase. I say there's some obvious and not so obvious reasons why we've seen these increases, but one of the reasons why is that some of the major triggers for gambling are being exacerbated during COVID, in particular during these periods of isolation. And obviously these triggers can include loneliness, boredom, stress, anxiety, and depression. So we're seeing this as an increase. So it's giving us some real challenges during this period of COVID, to be honest.
A lot to mull over and think over there. You mentioned something interesting, Neil. I'm going to come back to you, and that was the Gambling Act of 2005, because I know that's currently under review, and it is 15 years ago. So we'll touch upon that. So hold that thought. Suhayl, coming more to something else that was in the news last week, which I know we talked about off air briefly, was that the National Lottery minimum age is going up from 16 to 18 next year, and that made all the headlines in all the press last week. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a good thing in general, and what led to that? What are your general actual aspirations moving on from that?
I believe it's obviously I've found a good decision that's been made, and it closely relates to what I've said previously, where individuals who gamble in their formative years, then they're more likely to develop into problematic gamblers. And a lot of times when individuals do experience, young people, a big win, so that when the first time I kind of placed a bet in, I would say one of my first 3 to 5 bets, I won significant amount of money, and that was the big win, and that big win then escalated. So and I think it's a good decision that was taken, and I believe that although I didn't engage in national lottery, but there are individuals out there in our communities who spend a significant amount of money gambling every week. I knew somebody who gambled at least £50 a week for many, many, many years. So, and the level of financial harm that creates is significant, and that then brings other issues into play, such as domestic violence and food poverty, etc. So I think it's a great decision. And the fact that Neil talked about the normalization of gambling, so kind of increasing it to 18 sends a message that it's although I don't agree with gambling in itself, but it's an over 18 activity, so that's a statement in itself.
And Suhayl, so one of the things that talked about with the advertising codes, I think they do talk about not exposing under 18s, and I guess carrying on the theme of the age there about the National Lottery. And we talked about Premier League, didn't we? And during the initial phases of the COVID lockdown, actually the amount of betting and gambling actually reduced. But once the shops opened, once the Premier League restarted, that's when we saw the month-on-month increase. What can we do? Because in essence, there may be some argument that betting and gambling pays a large degree of money towards the actual upkeep of this country. I think 0.5 or 1% of the GDP. So is the answer banning it, or is it what's your perspective?
Well, I personally, when we do engage in our work around gambling related harm, I focus on the harm, because that's a battle which, is for somebody else, in terms of whether, as a faith community, coming from a faith community, I believe gambling is, it creates, it's a social ill. It doesn't do, I don't believe it does good in society in itself, generally speaking. However, gambling operators do have a responsibility to act, in a way that they are reducing the harm proactively. And although you say that, sponsorship or advertising has been curbed somewhat, that was after some very hard lobbying. And if you watch football, for example, at halftime, Ray Winston adverts, etc., were very common once upon a time. So slowly, I do believe that there is a lot of heat on advertising to be kind of curbed and whittled down, in order to protect individuals. But it's just, I feel the advertising, gambling in itself, whether it's legal or not, that's not the point right now. The point is that the proliferation of the amount of advertising that goes on, like celebrities endorsing gambling. For example, Jose Mourinho, I think he took a part in a gambling advert as well. So it's that kind of advertising which is problematic, because role models are effectively seen to be advertising a product which is potentially harmful for some.
Yeah, it's a very broad web, isn't it? Especially when you're affiliated with certain institutions or clubs who have them as sponsors. Some of the terms maybe that you need to partake, and we have to be involved in marketing. So I guess, Neil, then Suhayl touched on the harms. What do we need to be aware of? I guess there is a link with criminality. There is a link with unemployment, a greater link. So when does it become an issue for someone to recognize that gambling is not for them?
Let's take your first point about the link between criminality and gambling and problem gambling. I sit as a commissioner on the Howard League Commission and the link between problem gambling and criminality in the UK. And the evidence is pretty clear that in order to gamble, when the addiction becomes acute, there's one thing that you need, and that's money, right? And the reality of it is that there is a clearer link between gambling or problem gambling and money than there is with other addictions, because you can barter, you can trade, you can do different things. So there is a greater link between gambling and criminality than there is with other addictions. So that is the first point. And then when we move towards the harm that is created by gambling, I mentioned earlier on about being a public health issue. I mentioned the issue about going to the GP, but you're 9 times more likely to access mental health services, 6 times more likely to be in a hospital inpatient, and 4 times more likely to be in prison than the general population if you do have the addiction. So yes, we need to look at this from a much broader perspective, and we need to ratchet this up the public health agenda.
Good. Neil, I said I'd come back to you about that Gambling Act from 2005 and how there's a review of that going on at the moment. And I think that's partly because we live in a digital age, but maybe some of the legislation was made for an analog age. And now that's the discrepancy. In the last 15 years, gambling has taken over so many different digital arenas. First of all, what are your thoughts on the Gambling Commission and how it's regulating? And what do you think of the level of regulation of gambling and how that fits into this review? I imagine perhaps as a charity yourself, you might feed into this review, Neil.
Yeah, and it's the big questions there that you ask that I don't really think we've got the time to go through them all in real detail. However, I think that the countries that have the most reduced levels of gambling-related harm are those that are really clearly overregulated, and we've got ourselves into something of a dilemma. You mentioned it earlier before about the issue with the exchequer. Yes, we've got an industry that employs over 120,000 people. About 70% of the population gambled last year and see it as a recreational activity. So we've got some challenges there. With regard to the new act, yes, you're very, very correct in that it's outdated. It was developed in 2005 with the Labour government then, and yeah, we've moved on significantly since then. From the Commission's perspective, I commend the Commission in the work that it's doing. The Commission is now leading on the national strategy for reducing gambling harms in the UK, and has made real progress in that regard. And I believe that we will see the impact of the Commission leading on that strategy in the amendments to the new Act. So whilst it may well have been slow for some individuals, I think we are making progress, and we're going to see big changes in regulation, advertising and other areas as we move forward within the UK.
Great, very diplomatic answer there, Neil, for what could have opened up a real can of worms. Suhayl, I want to come to you, obviously, in terms of tangible things people can do to get better. And it ties in with a question that we've had. The question was measures or changes of habits that can prevent someone from gambling. I know you described it as a social ill, to use your words, but as Neil said, 70% of the population, and from my understanding, nearly half of the population gamble at least once a month from what I read. So whichever way you look at it, it's commonplace. It's not going away. It's not going to be made illegal anytime soon. So we've got to live with it. So tell me how to live with it. And to assist you, I'm also going to just put on the screen a good link from patient.co.uk, which links to a leaflet from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I know they've led on trying to help with problem gambling. So I'll put that also for the listeners and the viewers so they can have a look at that. But yeah, Suhayl, your insight as to how we can actually get better with this.
So in terms of how individuals can help themselves, is that what you mean? How individuals can help themselves?
Yeah, the measures and habits to get out of the cycle of destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly is an individual has to have some sense of admission that gambling has become unbearable, and they've got to admit that it's had them beat. So it's very much like the kind of Gamblers Anonymous approach, where you have the 12 steps, which are quite effective, because many a times individuals would have broken relationships, and a lot of times there's resentment there as well. So it's a process where individuals start connecting with society and people around them. And as we know, the opposite of addiction, people say, is connection. And what you do find with individuals coming into recovery is that they're quite isolated. Their support networks whittled down through problematic gambling and the chain of events that followed subsequently. So the main thing individuals need help with is building up their self-esteem. Okay, so the fact that to be congratulated for showing the strength that they've come into treatment, they've come into support, and then having that regular, having a timetable of activities. So individuals, generally speaking, would have spent 6+ hours maybe in a day, or 4+ hours in a day gambling. Now, what do they do with that time? So it's helping individuals find something to replace that, which is meaningful. And exercise is quite good as well, so it's almost like a holistic approach towards that person's recovery and finding meaningful things to do. And the other is, a lot of times, especially in the initial stages, a lot of individuals feel uncomfortable handling money. Now, I believe that handing over somebody your finances is actually taking responsibility. So maybe an interim period of time, they may want to hand over the account to a family member, trusted friend, or someone, so that they can manage. Now, and sometimes some people are reluctant to do this, but it can be of a great help whilst they can just focus on their recovery, focus on that time away, and managing their feelings, managing other stresses which were caused as a result of their gambling behavior. Now, sometimes there's a taboo around counseling as well. So even it could be somebody, a trusted friend who they see quite regularly, or somebody like myself within the community who's had that experience, who's been there and are able to kind of show the empathy and understand. So having that regular contact with somebody can serve as a great boost and motivation in continuing that abstinence or sobriety away from gambling. Because I seldom believe that, you know, individuals who have shown significant level of harm then can gamble recreationally. I think the evidence for that is quite weak. So I think total abstinence may be required, you know.
Great, thanks, Suhayl. And I guess just following your role as a community connector, what role does ethnicity have when it comes to gambling? As there is some emerging evidence that BAME and LGBT communities are actually at greater risk when it comes to gambling addiction.
Yeah, I think the evidence has always been there, because I think it was in the early 2010, somebody wrote a paper, and within that they mentioned that individuals from ethnic minority experience disproportionate or double the harm if they do gamble. Now, I think it's anecdotally, me and Neil have been around the Northwest, met with many individuals, and what we believe anecdotally, and research is something which is lacking in this area, and that's what we're trying to advocate or facilitate for. But we have seen anecdotally a massive amount of harm, and the amount of harm on the affected other is, so that could include relationship breakdowns, loss of employment, significant level of debt. And what we've noticed that individuals are just too afraid and too ashamed to come and ask for help. And a lot of times when I was engaging in that behavior, gambling, then I would not seek support from the gambling industry or from the betting shops. Beacon, it had to be Beacon because it was seen to be an independent organization. So I think there's also some issue around safer gambling messages, where when the fun stop. This message does not resonate very well with the community, where generally speaking gambling is not accepted. So what type of messages should be there? Because I think within our GP surgeries or within our community organizations, you know, you might be able to get help for drugs and alcohol, but very rarely, a lot of people are quite lost in terms of what do we do if an individual is struggling with gambling. And that was the whole point of the conference on the 19th of November, is actually to highlight a growing issue within the BAME communities in general.
Thank you, Suhayl. And Neil, I understand there's been a world's first, I understand, from Gordon Moody, a kind of a residential treatment centre that's opened in the Midlands. Is this what you suspect will happen going forward? And are there any kind of recommendations in terms of medications to try and help with gambling?
Well, first of all, just Gordon Moody actually started, I think it's, forgive me, I think it's not far short of about 80 or 90 years ago, the Reverend Gordon Moody. It's one of the first residential centres for the issue. To ask the question about medication, I think we need to look at this as a general mental health issue in lots of different ways, and the recovery from a gambling addiction is not best facilitated through the ingestion of a pill or some form of medication. I think that if we're going to go down the route of being, you know, pharmacologically dependent upon these sorts of things for you know, that our answer lies in that, I think we're a million miles away from that. So I think that we need to have a look at the whole journey of recovery. And one of the things I just want to bring up now is the issue of what I class as the best kept secrets within the UK, and that's our treatment and support network are free, which is important to say, especially for somebody who's experiencing gambling related harm. Their economic situation is not great, generally speaking. So this is a free and confidential service. There is a national service for this. that is fully integrated within the NHS. And I think it's important that we bring that into people's awareness. This is a free, local, fully confidential service that is becoming very culturally sensitive and appropriate as we move forward. And we'll give you the numbers to access that service, hopefully before the end of the programme.
Great. Okay, Neil. Suhayl, the concept of impulse control disorders, there's a theme with that, and we see that with certain medications. I know that in terms of dopamine agonists, things that we sometimes use for Parkinson's and other conditions, and that's associated with, I'm not sure as doctors if we always remind them about these side effects, but it is important. Is it something you've seen in terms of medications and how it can lead to pathological gambling as a side effect from medication? Do you have any experience of seeing that at all?
Yes, when I was in attending Gamblers Anonymous, then a young lady came through, and she was taking some medication, and one of the side effects was a gambling related type of behavior. So, and she kind of developed a great problem with it itself. But I don't have any other kind of experience with it, although I just kind of want to reiterate what Neil said, really, because and something we touched upon earlier in the show, which is, adverse childhood experiences. So many times individuals are seeking to fill a void. Initially, I thought it was a financial issue, but very quickly I kind of realized when I was seeking that treatment, that was actually quite repressed in my emotions. And once I did that, once I found a safe space and individuals to talk to, then I think that helped me massively, because I was using it as a coping strategy, and at this moment in time, getting good support from the Beacon Counselling Trust, definitely. So to answer your question, I don't really have that much experience, but I do know certain drugs do have that kind of side effect, which result in people gambling pathologically.
Yeah, thanks. And just for people wondering about this, it's a fairly rare, but it is something worth talking to your GP about. If you're on medication like Parkinson's or certain depression or high prolactin or restless legs, they will often mention that. We're coming rapidly to the end of the show. I do want Mehran to close with the top 3 tips. Suhayl, you've got a bit of a head start to think about those. Before we get on to that, Neil, give us some more last tips about accessing support for the general population and what they can do, especially in COVID times where a lot of things are happening remotely.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, if anybody feels that they are at risk of or experiencing gambling-related harm, that's either as a gambler or what we class as an affected other, somebody who's affected by somebody else's gambling, my very, very clear request is that you ring the national helpline number on 0808 8020 133 without delay. You'll be engaged. That's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week number. You'll be engaged with one of the operators who will be there to help you and to direct you to the most appropriate level of service within the network. So please don't hesitate to call that number. It's free, it's confidential, and you will be referred, if required, to a local support service.
Great, thank you, Neil. So Suhayl, I'm going to come to you. What 3 tips would you like to share with the audience?
Firstly, a tip for individuals. This particular depends on where they are in the scale of gambling, but this gambling addiction could take away everything which is beloved for them. So break that silence and seek that help. There's no shame in asking for help. It's a sign of empowerment. You're empowering yourself to put yourself on that journey of recovery. The other advice is to family members and individuals in community that we've got to show a compassionate response towards individuals or struggling, no matter what actions or what they tend to, what they would have done, the gambler itself, because keep those doors open for individuals to come and ask for help and support. And the other is for organizations which are like schools or evening schools, for them to kind of facilitate into the curriculum important gambling education, because I think it is imperative that our young people are empowered into making informed choices for themselves.
Great, thank you, Suhayl. And what about your 3 tips, Neil?
Well, I think there's, my 3 tips are, first of all, this is not an addiction that should be engaged with in isolation. It's hard work to overcome a gambling addiction, as is with other addictions. And recovery from this addiction is best facilitated with support. We mentioned the issue about medication earlier on. You know, medication can help in certain circumstances, but it can also hinder, right? So, you know, we need support for this. We need support for recovery. So that's the first point. So the second tip is that we need to seek that support at the earliest possible point. So the earlier the intervention, clearly the much better the outcome. And my final point is that obtaining support is easy. Either contact Beacon on across the Northwest on 0151 226 0696, or contact the National Helpline 24 hours, 7 day a week on 0808 8020 133 for that's free and confidential support.
Thank you so much to both of you for coming on tonight, giving up your time, your wisdom, and educating the public. It's been great having you both, Neil and Suhayl, tonight. All that remains is for us to mention that we're coming to our time ending tonight, and also on our time since April as well. We've got one show next week, and then which is our penultimate show, and then one to do with COVID at the end of December. But we've had a great time doing this every week since April. Over to you, Mehran, to explain what's happening next week.
Yeah, thank you, Fahim. And again, just a big thanks to both Neil and Suhayl for sharing their expertise. It's been really insightful. I guess next week, hopefully the audience can expect a conversation on organ donation. It's something that is very important. The law has changed this year, so we've got numerous clinicians as well as individuals who have either donated or have gone through the process, with a special appearance from the Bishop of Manchester as well within that. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I hope you do find it of use, and it will help you make a decision, because I think we all need to be in a position where we need to decide, are we for donation or against, and just make our decision clear, because there is no right answer on this. Thank you. So thanks again, and apologies for being late, but I really enjoyed being involved in the conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, everyone. And remember, we've got our webinar tomorrow evening again, Wednesday, December 16th at 7 p.m. And thank you to Neil and Suhayl, and good evening to everyone. Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.